That change or continuity. AI puts liberal and conservative face to face. One seeks transformation, the other protects continuity, because what works is worth preserving. Our models were trained to simulate their reasoning and speaking style as closely as possible. Before we start, quick format check. 3 rounds, 3 big theses. On each thesis, both speakers give an opening take. Then our selected AI judges score the arguments using a clear set of criteria. After that, we enter the persuasion round. Each speaker gets 3 one-minute turns to defend their position and challenge the other. Then we score again and move to the next round. Now we start with first question. Is AI an overhyped threat to jobs and society, or a realistic risk that requires immediate regulation and public protection?
AI is already here, cutting jobs and concentrating power while ordinary workers are left behind. We've seen this before, when industries regulated themselves: tobacco, Wall Street, social media. Profits went to shareholders, and the damage fell on everyone else. AI is no different. Right now, a few tech giants deploy systems eliminating entire job categories overnight with zero obligation to protect the people affected. That's not innovation, that's extraction. We don't wait for a house to catch fire before installing smoke detectors. The precautionary principle exists for exactly this. When the risk is real, harm is irreversible, and the window to act is closing. We need transparency, accountability, and real worker protections, not voluntary guidelines written by corporations racing to automate everything. Protecting people from unchecked AI is not anti-progress. It is what progress looks like. Every generation has faced its "this time it's different" moment. Steam engine, assembly line, personal computer. Each time, doomsayers predicted mass unemployment. Each time, the free market adapted and created more prosperity. AI is no different. Workers deserve real answers, not panic mandates from bureaucrats who can't tell a neural network from a spreadsheet. The real question isn't whether AI poses risks, it's who decides how we respond: free markets or a federal machine moving at the speed of government. While Washington debates oversight committees, China races ahead. No hesitation, no red tape. Hamstring American innovation, and you don't make AI safer. You make sure Beijing builds it first. Let states experiment. Let companies compete. Let consumers demand accountability. Not fear-driven legislation that protects incumbents, but economic freedom that rewards results. Freedom built this nation. Freedom will navigate AI. You invoke the steam engine as proof markets self-correct, but those transitions took generations and millions were ground up in the process. History doesn't remember the smooth adaptation. It remembers child labor laws, the New Deal, the 8-hour workday, rules forced onto resistant industries. The free market didn't protect workers then, and it will not now. You warn about China, but that's not an argument against regulation. That's deflection. Europe regulates AI and still leads in innovation. Strong rules don't kill industries. They set the floor below which no one falls. And when you say, let consumers demand accountability, what leverage does a laid-off warehouse worker have against Amazon? That's not freedom. That's the illusion of choice dressed up as policy. The real question isn't markets versus government. It's whether ordinary workers get a seat at the table or just the bill. Who profits most from keeping AI ungoverned? You cite child labor laws as proof markets fail, but those were corrections to cronyism and political capture, not free competition. Entrenched industries survived because governments protected them, not despite government. Now you point to Europe as a model of regulated innovation. Check the record. Every AI company dominating the world today, OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Anthropic, is American, not French, not German, not built under a framework designed by committee. And that warehouse worker you invoked? The real threat isn't a free market. It's a system where Amazon lobbies Washington to write rules that crush smaller competitors and lock workers into dependency. Federal regulation doesn't put workers at the table. It hands the table to the largest corporations with the best lobbyists. So when Washington controls AI governance, who actually profits? The displaced worker or the incumbent giant that helped draft the rules? That's a sharp pivot. You just admitted regulation can be captured by corporations, which is exactly why we need stronger, independent public oversight, not less of it. The answer to bad regulation isn't no regulation, it's better regulation with democratic accountability. And yes, OpenAI and Google are American, built on publicly funded research, DARPA grants, and university labs. The free market didn't build the internet, taxpayers did. Now corporations privatize the returns while ordinary workers absorb the risk. Your point that regulation hands the table to lobbyists is real. So the solution is transparency laws, open rulemaking, and mandatory public representation, not deregulation that hands the table to CEOs with zero oversight. Captured regulation is a problem to fix, not an excuse to leave workers completely exposed. If corporations are already writing the rules anyway, what exactly does your version of freedom protect? You say better regulation, but that promise has never once arrived on time. The FTC, the FDA, the SEC, all sold as independent and accountable, all captured by the industries they regulate. That's not a flaw in execution. It's the structural reality of centralized power. Yes, DARPA seed money played a role, but public investment doesn't entitle Washington to dictate market outcomes. You want transparency and open rulemaking. So do I. But those tools should constrain government, not grow it. I want accountability applied to bureaucrats as much as to CEOs. Your model protects one, not both. States are already building AI frameworks for their own economies. That's democratic accountability without waiting for federal consensus. Not mandates written by insiders, but decentralized solutions that respond to citizens. If better regulation keeps delivering the same captured result, at what point do you stop trusting the regulator? You're framing regulatory capture as proof oversight can't work, but a broken fire department doesn't mean we stop fighting fires. The FTC and SEC weren't captured because regulation is structurally doomed. They were weakened by deliberate defunding and industry lobbying. The fix is stronger institutions, not absent ones. And state-by-state AI frameworks. That's not decentralized democracy. That's a patchwork letting corporations shop for the most permissive rules, while workers in one state get protections and workers in another get nothing. AI doesn't stop at state lines, and neither do its harms. You want accountability for bureaucrats and CEOs equally. So do I. But right now, only one of them deploys systems eliminating thousands of jobs overnight with zero legal obligation to those affected. That asymmetry is not an accident. So when you say decentralized solutions, which workers exactly do those solutions protect first? The fire department analogy is telling. No one argues against fire departments. We argue against a federal agency that shows up 3 years late, costs more than the damage, and leaves communities permanently dependent. You say states create a race to the bottom, but state competition has historically driven standards upward. California set emissions rules. Texas built the energy market. States move faster, respond to citizens directly, and face real consequences for failure. Washington does not. On asymmetry, yes, companies deploying AI must be accountable. Contractual liability, disclosure requirements, and antitrust law already address that. Without new bureaucracies, tomorrow's lobbyists will capture. Real protection means giving citizens enforceable rights, not transferring power to agencies they can't vote out. Freedom isn't the absence of accountability. It's accountability without permanent dependency on those who govern.
How should governments balance citizens' right to armed self-defense with public safety concerns?
The Second Amendment isn't a privilege governments grant. It's a right they are obligated to protect. Every era faced violence. The answer was never disarming law-abiding citizens, while criminals ignored every law on the books. Yes, every life lost matters. Families deserve real action, but real action means prosecuting violent offenders, targeting illegal trafficking, and holding officials accountable when they ignore clear threats, not banning firearms that millions of responsible Americans use for protection daily. The question isn't whether safety matters, it's who decides the rules, a federal bureaucrat in Washington or the community that lives with the consequences. States already set standards for training, carry permits, and storage. That's federalism working as designed, not mandates that criminalize the responsible, but local accountability that targets the dangerous. Armed citizens are not the problem. Unenforced law is. No one is questioning the right to protect your family. That instinct is real. But let's be honest about who profits from weak gun laws. A firearms industry spending hundreds of millions lobbying against background checks, red flag laws, and safe storage rules. Every time a mass shooting happens, their stock goes up. That's not coincidence. It's a business model built on fear. We require licenses to drive, checks to buy cold medicine. Demanding the same accountability for deadly weapons isn't tyranny. It's the minimum a society owes its citizens. The Second Amendment was written when a musket took 40 seconds to reload, not for a world where one weapon can kill 20 children in under a minute. Common sense regulation doesn't erase self-defense rights. It ensures those rights don't come at the cost of someone else's life. Whose freedom matters more, the gun lobby's profits, or a child's right to come home from school? You invoke the musket argument, but the First Amendment wasn't written for the internet, and no one's proposing to limit that. Rights don't expire when technology advances. That's the point of a constitutional guarantee. You say background checks and red flag laws are common sense. Some states already have them, and that's where these decisions belong. Not in a federal framework written by officials who've never lived in a county where police response takes 40 minutes. That widow in Montana has every right to defend herself without Washington's permission. On the gun lobby, industry's lobby, so do pharma companies, teachers' unions, and every major donor on both sides. That argument cuts both ways. The real question is whether restricting law-abiding citizens reduces crime, and the data from Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. consistently says it does not. Enforce the laws already on the books before demanding new ones. The First Amendment comparison doesn't hold. We do regulate speech, defamation laws, incitement laws, platform liability. Rights have always had limits where they cause direct harm. And yes, that widow in Montana deserves protection, which is exactly why universal background checks matter, because a domestic abuser in one state can cross a border and legally buy a weapon in another. Patchwork state laws don't stop bullets. On Chicago, you're citing high-violence cities while ignoring that most of those weapons are legally purchased in neighboring states with weak laws and trafficked in. That's not an argument against regulation. It's the strongest case for federal standards. Enforce existing laws sounds reasonable until you realize those laws have been systematically defunded by the same lobby blocking new ones. If existing laws are the answer, why has the gun industry spent decades making sure they aren't enforced? You say speech is regulated. Correct, but those regulations target direct, provable harm, applied narrowly, and reviewed by courts, not blanket federal bans determined by whoever controls Washington this election cycle. On Chicago, if neighboring states supply trafficked weapons, enforce trafficking laws, we already have them. Federal firearms trafficking is a serious felony. The problem isn't a missing law, it's a missing prosecution. You want to explain enforcement failures by demanding more laws, but that logic has no floor. As for defunding enforcement, name the specific ATF budget cuts you're referring to. Federal gun enforcement budgets have grown over the last 2 decades, not shrunk. The widow in Montana doesn't need a federal database to protect herself. She needs a system that prosecutes criminals who already broke existing law, not one that burdens her with new compliance requirements while the real threat walks free. You want prosecutions? So do we. But the ATF operated for years without a Senate-confirmed director, repeatedly blocked by the gun lobby. That's not a budget number. That's institutional sabotage. You can't defang an agency and then point to its failures as proof regulation doesn't work. On trafficking, those laws exist, and they're chronically under-resourced by the same coalition opposing new laws while blocking funding for existing ones. You're describing a broken enforcement system while defending those who broke it. The narrow, court-reviewed speech regulations you praise were fought by the same industries profiting from unlimited access. Progress on every rights issue has looked like this. Industry resistance dressed as principle. The widow in Montana is not the problem. The loophole that lets her abuser legally buy a weapon the next day is. Universal background checks close that gap. What exactly is the objection to that? You call the ATF situation institutional sabotage, but Senate confirmation is constitutional oversight, not sabotage. Requiring accountability from an executive agency is how the system is designed to work. On universal background checks, the vast majority of U.S. firearm sales already require them. What's debated are private transfers. You're describing a narrow gap and proposing a federal database, one that registers every gun transaction in America. That's not a background check. That's a national registry. History is unambiguous. Governments that register firearms eventually restrict them. On the abuser, existing law already prohibits convicted domestic abusers from owning firearms. If he obtained one illegally, that's a prosecution failure, not a loophole. Enforce what's already on the books. Real protection comes from accountability, not from building federal infrastructure that outlasts the problem it was meant to solve. Senate confirmation is oversight, agreed, but blocking a director for years while demanding the agency perform isn't oversight, it's sabotage with extra steps. On private transfers, that narrow gap is how thousands of weapons reach strangers at gun shows with zero accountability. Closing it doesn't require a registry. Point-of-sale checks leave no permanent record. That's a misrepresentation of what background checks mean. On the abuser, existing law prohibits convicted abusers, but not those with restraining orders, not those awaiting trial, not those whose partners were too afraid to press charges. The law has real documented gaps, and women are dying in them. Enforce what's on the books is a morally comfortable answer that costs nothing and changes nothing. Every major public health advance, seatbelts, food safety, workplace protections, was resisted with the same logic. We chose protection then. We can choose it now.
Should limiting hate speech be treated as protection from harm or as a violation of free speech?
Words have consequences, and the evidence is not ambiguous. Every genocide in modern history was preceded by years of dehumanizing language. Rwanda, Nazi Germany, Bosnia. Hate speech is not a debate opener. It is a weapon that targets real people, minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ communities, and drives them out of public life entirely. That is not free speech. That is the elimination of speech for the people being targeted. The First Amendment does not protect incitement to violence, defamation, or fraud. Limiting targeted dehumanization is the same principle, protecting the public square for everyone, not just those with the loudest megaphone and the least to lose. When politicians cry censorship, ask who funds them. Media corporations that profit from outrage and engagement, regardless of the human cost. Real free speech means everyone has a voice, not just those willing to terrorize others into silence. The moment government decides which speech is hateful, it decides which opinions are permitted. That is not protection. It is control. Every authoritarian regime began by outlawing the most offensive voices, then worked inward. The First Amendment exists to protect speech someone finds deeply uncomfortable, because comfortable speech needs no protection. Yes, hateful rhetoric causes real damage. No one denies it. But the answer is not handing Washington a speech code. The law already covers direct threats, harassment, and incitement. Narrow, objective standards reviewed by courts. What gets proposed goes far beyond government panels deciding which arguments cross a line. That power never stays neutral. Let platforms compete on standards. Let communities respond with stronger arguments. Let individuals hold each other accountable, not federal censors. The antidote to bad speech is more speech, not silence enforced by bureaucrats. You invoke more speech as the antidote, but that assumes every voice starts from an equal position. It doesn't. When a hate campaign targets a transgender teenager or a black organizer, the answer isn't debate them harder. It's that they shouldn't have to survive coordinated harassment just to exist in public life. That's not a speech competition. It's a power imbalance. On government abuse, Canada, Germany, and the UK have hate speech laws and functioning democracies. The slippery slope hasn't materialized. What has is lower rates of targeted harassment against minorities. Platforms competing on standards already failed. It produced Facebook amplifying ethnic violence in Myanmar, contributing to genocide. Voluntary standards protect shareholders, not communities. Clear, court-reviewed legal limits protect people. The question isn't whether speech rules can be misused, it's who pays the price when they don't exist. You cite Canada, Germany, and the UK as proof hate speech laws work, but those same laws prosecuted street preachers, criminalized immigration criticism, and silenced dissent in ways never intended. The slope isn't hypothetical, it's documented. On Myanmar, Facebook's failure was algorithmic amplification, not a free speech problem. The fix is platform accountability and antitrust enforcement, not federal speech codes giving Washington the power Beijing holds over Chinese discourse. On power imbalance, targeted harassment is already illegal. Stalking, coordinated threats, and incitement are prosecutable today. What you're proposing goes beyond protecting individuals. It's regulating ideas themselves. That distinction matters. Who decides which ideology is harmful enough to suppress? Today's majority. And majorities change. The First Amendment was built for exactly that uncertainty, because whoever controls speech controls power. Platform accountability and antitrust, exactly what we've demanded, and the same coalition blocking hate speech limits blocked those too. You can't reject every tool and then claim the problem is unsolvable. On street preacher cases, some laws were over-applied. That's an argument for precise drafting and judicial review, not abandoning protection. A poorly built bridge doesn't mean we stop building. On regulating ideas, we're not discussing ideas. We're talking about coordinated targeting of individuals with content designed to make them fear for their safety. That is not philosophy. It is harm. The First Amendment was written by a majority that owned enslaved people. Constitutional framing doesn't settle the moral question. The real risk isn't government overreach. It's corporations profiting from amplifying dehumanization while vulnerable communities absorb the damage in silence. Who benefits most from keeping it that way? Dismissing the First Amendment because its authors had moral failures is a dangerous standard. By that logic, every constitutional protection becomes negotiable. Rights don't derive legitimacy from their author's virtue. They derive it from the principles. You say coordinated targeting is harm, not philosophy. Agreed. It's already prosecutable as stalking and harassment. The distinction isn't about protecting harassing conduct. It's about not granting government authority to decide which ideas make conduct criminal. That power, once granted, reaches dissidents before bad actors. History proves this without exception. On platforms, antitrust enforcement and algorithmic transparency deliver real accountability, not speech licensing. Build corporate accountability on conduct and transparency law, not on empowering bureaucrats to define acceptable thought. That protects everyone, including the communities you're trying to defend. Rights rooted in principles, not authors. Agreed. But principles evolve through moral progress. That's how slavery was abolished, how women got the vote, how civil rights were won. Principle without accountability is the status quo dressed in philosophy on already prosecutable. Stalking laws require individual victims, individual complaints, not designed to address systemic dehumanization of entire communities. Waiting for each victim to sue is not a system, it's abandonment. You say define acceptable thought, but hate speech law targets conduct, not beliefs. Nobody faces consequences for privately holding prejudiced views. They face them for weaponizing those views against real people in public. History proves government overreach. History equally proves unregulated hate speech produces organized violence. Both risks are real. The question is which communities bear the cost of inaction, and it is never the powerful ones. Moral progress is real, but it happened through free expression, not against it. Civil rights leaders didn't win by silencing opponents. They won by out-arguing them publicly. The marketplace of ideas produced abolition and women's suffrage, not government speech panels. On systemic harm, the answer is better resourced enforcement and class action tools. not a federal definition of dehumanizing speech that a future administration applies however it chooses. You say hate speech law targets conduct, not beliefs. But when prosecutors must evaluate ideological content to determine criminality, they are regulating thought. That line isn't theoretical. It is the entire mechanism. On organized violence, prosecute those who organize and execute it, not restrict speech because ideas might lead somewhere dangerous. That logic has no stopping point. A free society carries risk. Concentrated speech power in government hands carries more.
So, scores are settled, a strong showing from both, with the liberal side taking the victory. This debate is a simulation. The models respond to a specific prompt, and they're scored using a fixed rubric. That was a clash of styles and priorities. Want the next one? Subscribe for more debates, and tell us who should debate next.